Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Justice and Technology Conference. My name is Parwez Besmel. I am an assistant teaching professor at Northern University. I am also a fellow in the Global Justice Program here at Yale University. Today, we have a very special keynote speaker who is a widely published, world-renowned scholar and a leading expert on economic development and the fight against poverty. I have no doubt he will enlighten us today and leave us inspired. Our honorable keynote speaker is Jeffrey Sachs, who is a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Professor Sachs is a prolific scholar who has authored and edited many significant books, including The End of Poverty, The Age of Sustainable Development, and The Age of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. With all his busy academic life, Professor Sachs has also served as special advisor to 3 UN Secretary Generals, including Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres. Professor Sachs has traveled to more than 125 countries to share his valuable insights with governments and institutions on how to end poverty, fight hunger, and promote sustainable environmental practices. It is no surprise that he is currently joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh of Egypt. He is there attending the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Sachs to our Technology and Justice Conference. Over to you, Professor Sachs.
Parvez, thank you very much. Greetings, everybody. Very nice to be with you. And greetings from COP27. Excuse me. Maybe I'll just speak for a few minutes. We have a half an hour. It's getting late here. So I'll speak for a few minutes about what's happening at COP27. And then we could have a discussion perhaps for 15 minutes. At any of these COP meetings once a year, there are two very distinct parts of the meeting. One is what goes on in the negotiations of the various parts of the Paris Climate Agreement and the UN Framework Convention processes. And the other is a jamboree of 25 or 30,000 people working on various aspects of the climate issues, activists, experts, civil society organizations, UN agencies, and so forth. I'm part of the second part of this meeting. I'm not inside the negotiations. I'm not involved in drafting the final outcome statement, if there is one, or many of the laborious processes of the Paris Agreement and of the Framework Convention. And all I can sense from that is that there's no decisive breakthroughs or grand announcements that I would expect of a fundamental character from the intergovernmental negotiations. On the more public side, there are probably thousands of meetings, in fact, because there are hundreds of different sessions and engagement sites and short speeches and company presentations, national government presentations, and so on. And on that side of things, it's actually pretty impressive when you think about it. There's a very substantial climate action community in the world, and it is represented by all parts of the world, all sectors of society, and with a lot of technological interesting developments and real dynamism on new solutions, both on the mitigation side to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transform the energy system, and a bit less, but still not insignificant, to transform the land use and farm systems. And there's a great deal of effort being made in most parts of the world to do something along the necessary lines. And I have to say, even though one can be cynical about all of this, the depth of the community and these actions across many sectors is substantial at this point. It's not a small club trying to do something. It's not a small group of activists. It really is a significant global mobilization. We can't say that about the political, high political system engagement, which is, as I said, laborious, behind closed doors, grudging, and far short of what we would actually need to scale up the available toolkit to achieve anything close to net zero emissions by mid-century, which, as everybody knows, is more or less what's needed to have a fighting chance at keeping temperatures in the 1.5 degrees C range during the second half of this century, and to end the century perhaps with the temperature relative to the pre-industrial at no more than 1.5 degrees C. The UN estimates made last week in advance of COP27 were a trajectory to 2.6 degrees Celsius at the end of the century, with a pretty wide uncertainty band, but still the mean estimate at 2.6 degrees, which is very high, very serious, very likely to trigger feedback effects that could be dire, and so in no way satisfactory. But that is where the official processes take us. Let me say, just for 2 minutes, what would be needed to move from where we are to where we say we want to be, which is net zero by mid-century. At a technical level, there's a fairly clear pathway of what is needed. And part of it is moderately well known. Some of it is much less well known. So the part that's moderately well known is the energy sector transition, meaning especially the move to zero carbon electricity and electrification of transport and buildings and part of industry, and the use of green electricity to produce green hydrogen for some other difficult to electrify sectors of the economy, such as heavy freight over land and heavy ocean freight and metallurgy in the industrial sector. So the roadmap to the energy transformation is analytically moderately clear. The part that is much less clear is the land use and agriculture transformation, which is perhaps, according to many estimates, around 30% of total greenhouse emissions, partly carbon, but also a lot of methane in the agriculture sector, livestock and rice production, and also nitrous oxide, especially from fertilizer use and some other chemical applications in agriculture. And what to do about agriculture is a lot harder because there isn't one farm system. There are hundreds of farm systems, a lot very undercapitalized, many hundreds of millions of people still essentially in subsistence agriculture, many problems on land use, and many fewer instruments and transformative designs in the works. On energy, there's a very good model that the International Energy Agency has published for the last couple of years on a roadmap to 2050 for decarbonizing energy, but there is no comparable roadmap to 2050 to decarbonize, as it were, the farm sector and the land use sector. And so I would say on the what to do, we're maybe 60% of the way to having sorted out the basic pathways. I would also add that governments are far behind the academic community in understanding how to turn those pathways into actual public investment policies and overall energy strategies. Very few countries have policy roadmaps to 2050. Many of them have 2050 commitments. Many academic and interagency studies show how this can be done conceptually, but very little of this is embedded in public policies yet in most of the world. And that's partly because while there are hundreds of studies of what these pathways look like, most governments do not have detailed pathways to decarbonization. And it's something that they ought to have, because it's impossible to do this without analytical structure and without basically a planning and policy framework. So that's one side of things, is that there's some moderate clarity of what to do. There is much, much less action, in fact, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the what to do is not normal politics almost anywhere. It requires longer term planning, longer term policy, new governance structures within countries that take the energy transformation outside of the day-to-day politics in some way. And that's part of this. Another part, of course, is vested interests within almost all fossil fuel producing countries, and the United States is a prime example of that. If you have a lot of fossil fuels, there is a very strong lobbying and political pressure, often just straight out corruption or government dependency on the revenues of fossil fuels that make it hard for governments to move. So the action is stronger in the places bereft of fossil fuels. That's a large part of the world. And Europe is a good example of a region that is moving quite far on decarbonization, because Europe is blessed to have very few fossil fuels left. And because it is therefore dependent on importing fossil fuels rather than producing them domestically, there's less rearguard pressures on change, less domestic lobbying, and less fewer options for continuing to rely on the fossil fuel sector. And the war in Ukraine and the cutoff of Russian energy probably for Europe accelerates this process. So that's a second issue. A third issue that's very deep and very structural is that good energy system solutions generally require multi-country cooperation, because to build a low carbon power system, it really helps to have a large geography of many different kinds of renewable energy assets being fed into a common electricity pool. And that's because of the intermittency of the renewable energy. A larger geographic basin for renewable energy in an interconnected grid is better, but that means multi-country energy systems, and we lack the intelligence, the cross-border trust, the freedom of investment to actually pull that off in most places in the world. So countries are, to the extent that they're trying to decarbonize, are mainly doing it nation by nation rather than in regional groups, with Europe again being a partial exception to this. But in other regions of the world, it's almost straight national policies rather than regional interconnected policies. And when you think about places like Egypt, where we are right now, or the Gulf countries, which have a tremendous solar potential, they would develop that solar energy much faster if they could export it to Europe. But there is no reliable, open access to the European power market. In fact, maybe the opposite. And so the failures of the regional solutions is quite palpable. And then there's one final point that I think is essential for the developing countries, and that is the lack of adequate finance to actually pull off the energy transformation. There are three kinds of climate finance that are debated and that each require an answer. One is this transformative investment part, very capital intensive, rather expensive, and every country needs access to long-term capital in order to be able to invest in a low carbon energy system. But well over half the world's population is in countries that lack access to the needed capital. So that's one kind of financial issue. The other two are the costs of adapting to climate change, for example, building flood control measures or water storage measures in drought regions, or resilient infrastructure that can withstand stronger storms or more flooding. And the second is responding to disasters, which are coming with greater frequency, the so-called losses and damages agenda. So in summary, mitigation, adaptation, and losses and damages finance are the three main parts of the financing puzzle, and they're all radically underfinanced. And if there's one message from developing countries in the COP negotiations is show us the money. And there's different kinds of pools of funding that would be appropriate for these different categories. In my view, the adaptation and losses and damages should be paid heavily according to historical responsibility, whereas the mitigation should basically be financed by long-term low-interest loans. And the fact is, on all three categories, the amount of actual financing available to developing countries is a tiny fraction, maybe a fifth or a tenth of what would actually make the difference. And there are no breakthroughs right now. There are small incremental steps of greater financing, but no great breakthroughs. And one of the great disappointments in all of this is the United States government, because the US government remains at the center of financing structures like the World Bank, and the US political system is completely uninterested and unmotivated to actually finance solutions in developing countries almost entirely, except maybe a little bit to say we do it too in response to China's financing. So other than that, we don't have real solutions. And John Kerry, the US envoy on climate, is here to tout voluntary carbon markets, which is ridiculous, as a systemic answer to the financing issues. This is not going to be financed through voluntary carbon markets. And it's very sad that the world's largest economy, the world's largest historical emitter, comes to the COP with no answers in hand. And that's a big sign of how the world doesn't function properly right now. If it were a war, the United States might find the financing. But if it's only something as incidental and insignificant as climate change, it's just not worth it to the US Congress. This is, I'm being facetious, of course, but this is the strange reality of our country. So to conclude, lots of solutions, lots of demonstrations, lots of activity, lots of interesting discussion, lots of engagement all over the world, much advanced compared to 10 years ago in terms of a global mindset and interest groups and solution space, but still very far behind what would be a real scaled solution to all of this. And where we have the missing features are the geopolitical heft of major countries and the geopolitical cooperation needed to bring to the table real solutions for financing. Let me stop there, and we have a few minutes for questions, and I see some questions, so maybe I'll call Ray Jin first.
Hi, Professor Sachs.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm a sophomore at Yale University studying economics, and I'm one of Professor Pokey's students. So
Great.
thank you so much for coming here. My question was, I read your two articles published in Project Syndicate, respectively in October and November 2021, as well as your article in CNN in August 2022. I do agree that governments must finance an at-scale zero carbon infrastructure, such as national and regional renewable energy power grids, for instance. So my question is, how can countries overcome geopolitical, perhaps maybe even cultural differences to develop trust with each other and put collective action ahead of national interest in order to build these cross-border projects?
Great. So I think that geography really matters here. And I was in an interesting meeting a couple of days ago, which I had helped to initiate 4 years ago now, of countries of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. So this was, I mentioned in a speech in Cyprus in 2018 that the Eastern Mediterranean was basically a common ecosystem, shared ecosystem that was facing a lot of climate stress because of more drought-like conditions and rising sea levels and higher temperatures, and so that the countries of the region should get together to do something. And the president of Cyprus picked this up, and an expert institute in Cyprus called the Cyprus Institute became the secretariat of a process for this EMME grouping, Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East grouping. And it's a grouping that starts Egypt, the most westerly of the countries, and it includes Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel, the Gulf countries, Iraq, and Iran. Quite an interesting group, actually. And 3 years into this, we had a head of state meeting that President El-Sisi of Egypt and the president of Cyprus co-hosted, and it included the Prime Minister of Palestine, the Minister of Environment of Israel, and most of the countries of the region, not all of them, because Turkey and Cyprus don't talk enough, almost at all, and Iran was not present. But there was a lot of the region was there. Prime Minister of Iraq, the president of Egypt, as I said, senior Gulf country officials, and so on. And they were all talking together, and I pitched to them the idea of establishing a regional development bank for the Eastern Mediterranean Middle East region, because if we put money together and they pool their resources, then they're going to be much more likely to actually make the regional investments. But I could say I was very pleased to see a group of countries that's not generally on the same wavelength all around the table at the head of state level, and all realizing this is pretty desperate. And they were taking notes. They each spoke, but then listened to experts. I got to say a few things, and that kind of process is what we need everywhere. We need regions to be working together. And in the Asia context, I like the RCEP region, 15 countries, China, Japan, Korea, 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, New Zealand, as a grouping to look at an integrated energy system solution. Because RCEP exists, it's got a bit of structure, and it could be it could be a scaled area for energy transformation and infrastructure. And of course, it's like the countries that I mentioned in the Eastern Mediterranean. The tensions are high, and the United States stokes many of them, part of our geopolitics. But Japan, Korea, and China don't cooperate properly, and they need to. And if they got together better, and Australia put less time on its new military alliance with the US and more time on speaking with China about these issues, and created together with ASEAN this kind of grouping, there could be real progress, because very interesting grouping from an energy point of view. Even Australia could export a lot of solar energy in a submarine cable connecting to Indonesia. It would be great to connect Mongolia with the Northeast Asia. There are many interesting things to do, but it requires cooperation within the region. South America is another example where Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia really could make an integrated solution. But with Bolsonaro as president, it's been hopeless, because he wasn't interested in anything, and he blocked everything as the largest country in the region. But now with President Lula coming back to power and putting this in the highest priority for his government, we could see actually a regional strategy for South America. And then for the African Union, I'm absolutely preaching every day that Africa needs to address what is basically an utter scarcity, even of basic electrification, much less the kind of energy system that's needed. It needs to face that at a continental scale, at an African Union scale, with major interconnections of the grid itself, an African market that operates at scale, because if Africa operated in a unified way, it would be the same size in population as China and India. That would be a huge advantage for African development and for financing very heavy investments needed in basic infrastructure. So the AU is a potential vehicle for this as well. So my strategy would be get the countries to understand they really have a common fate in this area, and that this problem is serious enough that they should put aside a lot of other disputes to try to work on this, because they're not going to be able to solve the problems if they're more focused on the historical disputes than they are on building a future climate resilient, smart economy. And I'm trying to promote this kind of thinking region by region.
Yes. So I had a question that was based on something I heard in Marco Rubio's speech, victory speech, like a couple nights ago. And he said, basically, people voted for me because they don't like the government telling them, stop using gas, ride your bike, because John Kerry's going to COP27 and he needs to impress the other countries. Rather, they just want someone to lower gas prices for them, to give them, low prices, have them be able to buy things. And these simple things are what Americans want. And I think that's honestly true, right?
He's real clever. His platform is keep those hurricanes coming and make sure they come with ever greater force. because
Yeah.
Florida really enjoyed Hurricane Ian, and they'll enjoy the next Category 5 and the next Category 5. And I hear that the rising sea level will put Orlando underwater. So it's great. Marco Rubio's really looking after his constituents. These people are idiots, I'm sorry to say. They really are. They know how to get elected, but they don't know how to take care of the people that they represent. This is a very serious problem.
Mhm. But you know, based
Sorry,
that,
sorry to be so academic about it, but
that's okay. Um,
no, oh, I'm sorry, but what's your question?
Yeah, sure. Just like very, very simply, right? Just like what can we do to like the discount factor is a part of several models for climate change policy, right? And what do we do to get the discount factor to get us to discount the future much less, or to change people's consumption habits so that they don't kind of have this attitude where all I want is my gas prices to be low now. I don't care about what happens to me in the future.
Yeah, I don't believe that that's people's views, by the way. Uh, I I don't think Americans are actually, let me put it a different way. There's lots of polling that Yale does also that shows that Americans 65 or 70% put this issue as significant, want to find solutions, are worried about this. And I don't think our government does a very good job. I mean, I don't think any of the politicians does a very good job of really addressing what people sense that this is actually quite serious. Floridians are not going to be able to uh, insure their homes soon. They're going to have to retreat from coastlines. They are being hit by unprecedented storms like the one that just came through. It's true, Marco Rubio may know something about getting elected more than I do. Um, and he may want to be elected for that reason. But it would not be hard to help Floridians understand how urgent this is and how we need a different approach. That's his constituency. And I don't have, and my sense is that a lot of the politics is not driven by public attitudes. A lot of the politics is driven by the massive investments of the oil, gas, and coal industry in the Republican Party. And they get funded by this. Of course, the Democrats do too, like Joe Manchin, the Republicans even more. I think our politics pretty hopelessly corrupted, and that our politics is a lot worse than the American people are actually. But no one's explaining to them very clearly. Biden can't explain lucidly what this is all about. The Democrats don't do it. By the way, Joe Manchin is he's a Democrat who blocked any kind of serious policy from the Democratic side because without his vote, you couldn't even get regular reconciliation passed that could have had a real strategy for decarbonization. Instead, they passed a lot of tax cuts and tax credits, but not a real policy strategy. What's true is if Manchin had gone along, probably there's another Democrat on the take that would have blocked it. So I think Manchin's the front guy for probably a bench of 5 or 6 that wouldn't vote against the oil industry. But I don't think it's public opinion so much. I can't prove this, but I think that it should be possible to explain well that the disaster that the state just felt is going to be coming more and more and more, and the increases of their household insurance, property insurance premia is only a foreshadowing of what's going to happen, and that we could make a different case. But there's a lot of money on the other side. And in our politics, what really counts is campaign funding. This election cycle was, I didn't see the final number, but I think it's 15 or 16 billion dollars for this election cycle. That's a lot of corruption. And that is what's breaking the political system more than the views of the American people. That's my take.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So, Anat?
Hi, thanks so much for being here, for coming to us from there. I don't know, I don't know if this is an ethical or political or human rights question, but Naomi Klein put out an article about 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago in The Guardian, and the title was "Greenwashing a Police State, the Truth Behind Egypt's COP27 Masquerade." Basically telling the story of what goes on in Egypt, about how many people are there under political arrest. We know the stories. We know that Sharm el-Sheikh is a beautiful resort town with wonderful hotels and stuff.
It's a beautiful, it's not a beautiful resort town. It's got lots of hotels that are stamped along the coast.
Miami. Okay.
Yeah.
But I wonder, does that come up at all? The fact that the world is playing a game altogether. Does anyone differentiate between the morals that go into what we do day to day, where we go, who we talk to, who we then allow into the conversation, even though we know that in the matter of human rights, at least, they are criminals?
Yeah, there are few clean hands in this world. The human rights abuses by the United States are vast and persistent. The human rights abuses by Israel are vast. The human rights abuses by most countries are terrible. And so if we had that standard, nobody would talk to anybody. And what happens is the narrative is controlled. So we may think we're virtuous and the other side evil, but it's never like that, actually. So I don't want to stand up for anybody in this particular discussion. I'm aghast at US policy in general on many things. And by the way, even if our human rights abuses at home are merely awful, which they are, our human rights abuses internationally are war crimes on a repeated basis. So I actually want the meeting to talk about climate change. I don't like that particular narrative. I think the human rights narrative should basically start with self-analysis. And if human rights activists talked about their own country more and then said, okay, that's what's wrong with us, we hope that our counterparts say what's wrong with them, we'd actually get farther than pointing fingers at others, which is both hypocritical and ineffective. So this is you're touching on something that's a sore note for me, because the human rights discourse has become weaponized as an instrument of aggressive foreign policy in ways that I really don't like, because it's all us versus them thinking, which I don't think is going to get us to solutions. Having said all of that, that's tendentious, long-winded, off the point maybe. I would like serious discussion about climate here, irrespective really of whatever is charged. Egypt's not the worst by any means of what's going on in the world of real politics right now. So we need to solve this climate problem. And we actually need to we need to cooperate with China on this for sure. And so if our discourse is, well, we can't cooperate with China because of Xinjiang, I think that's hokey, by the way, because I think we are incredibly distorting a narrative for geopolitical, rhetorical purposes anyway. But also, we have actually really important things that we need to cooperate about, and we should. And we're not doing it because actually this human rights discourse is becoming a barrier to intergovernmental relations and to geopolitics across countries. I'm not, and I don't want to be misunderstood. I think that human rights are extremely important. I would like the United States to be a decent country. It's a decent country. I would like the United States to have a decent government, which it doesn't, and hasn't for my whole lifetime, because it's been in war almost nonstop, which I absolutely abhor. Having said that, again, I would like us to focus on the climate crisis, which is extremely serious. I'm glad that Egypt's hosting it for the following reason. They put a lot of the climate finance on the table, and it wasn't there before. What does one say about the human rights of the United States being responsible for 1/4 of the emissions, but being absolutely unwilling to talk about any financing for all of the people of the world being devastated by climate change? Isn't that a human rights abuse in and of itself? To my mind, it's a terrible human rights abuse. And that's the US, from my point of view, which is no sense of responsibility, no sense of accountability. And okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. David.
Okay, just in a, if it's possible, in a more positive note, if have you noticing along these years in this conference, if any constituency have changed radically its attitude, is any sector of civil society is more present and changed their mind, and if so, if that's the case, what would you think it was the case? So,
look, the main thing that's happened, slow, inconsistent, takes too long. The main thing that's happened is that the most of the world has rallied to the idea of decarbonizing the energy system sometime around 2050 to an outside of 2070. And so well over 100 countries have made that commitment. And every one of them is trying to do something along those lines after having made the commitment. That's a big change, actually. And that means that within those countries, civil society is trying to do things. I heard, in the last 3 days, really significant projects in Egypt, for example, on solar. And I've been spending a lot of time on significant projects in the Middle East on solar. And I just ran into someone building significant geothermal projects in Hokkaido for Japan. And there are lots and lots of investments being undertaken and solutions with this basic orientation to get to net zero. Before 2018, net zero to 2050 wasn't even a thing. I did a project on deep decarbonization in 2014 in the lead up to the Paris, and it was for the Paris negotiations. And we didn't think about getting to net zero by 2050. We had our teams aim for something like 1 ton per capita CO2 emissions by 2050, or if it was 2 tons, we regarded that as a moderate success in the modeling. So the idea that we should have a project of net zero by 2050 was not on the table. Then came the Paris Agreement and a quantitative target. And the quantitative target was stay well below 2 degrees and aim to stay below 1.5 degrees. And then the IPCC went to work and said, well, if you do those targets, if you want the 1.5 degrees, you have to decarbonize to zero, net zero by mid-century and net negative in the second half of the century. That was a big step forward, because that's a number that you can campaign on, rally for, even plan for, and analyze. And then I actually pressed and prevailed on the IEA, do a net zero by mid-century model. And they did one. And it's had a lot of effect by showing, okay, here's a benchmark. Here's how this could actually be done. And they just published the second version of it last week. So this is a big change, actually. What's happening now this year is really a lot of discussion that this world is so unfair. We're getting hammered and the rich countries are just standing by. So I think that's the main interesting melody line of dozens of governments here. And I support it entirely. I like complaining, and I like complaining of this sort. And so that's an advance also. So I think we're getting to more specific ideas, more specific timelines, more clarity of what should be done. And of course, we're not actually doing it for the reasons that I said, but things are more clear, more structured, and with many more tools in the toolkit than was true 5 years ago, even, and certainly than 10 years ago. So all of that's good. And I keep thinking if we don't blow ourselves up in the interim, there could be a moment of breakthrough that says, I'd love to see China say, by the way, we've thought about it hard. We put the NDRC to work. And in our next 5-year plan, we're actually going to do it by 2055, not 2060. And then 5 years after that, we're going to do it by 2050. That's really possible. That would be a big breakthrough, because that's a lot of emissions, and China could do it faster. So I think we're inching forward to a bigger breakthrough. What I'm spending almost all of my time on personally is the finance side. I'm trying to help the UN conceptualize what a real finance breakthrough would be. And I'm on my way to the G20 tomorrow to advance something that with the UN leadership we've been working on, which we call SDG stimulus, which is a major increase of investment flows for these things and for other SDGs, especially through the multilateral development banks. So I'm looking for a finance breakthrough as the next big step, because my sense is that for dozens of countries, the real limiting factor right now is it's all fine and good. We don't have fossil fuel anyway. We're perfectly happy to build our systems based on zero carbon energy, but we don't have any money even to build an energy system. So give us the money and we'll build the right system. And that is, I think that's really the view of 50 countries with 2 billion people in them. And I'd like to get them the money to actually build the right kind of energy system. So that's where I think the next breakthrough could come. We'll take one more. Halit?
Hi, thank you, Jeff, for having me also with my question. I mean, with such huge geopolitical and geoeconomic tectonic changes and tensions today, and with a view to your 40 years of international experience, what motivates you and makes you hopeful for our common future? Will we make it in the foreseeable future? And is the climate challenge a cultural challenge or cultural conflict at the same time?
Everything, that's what I've finally realized. Everything's a cultural challenge, by the way. Everything is about identity, trust, what we want, what we think is important, how we view our country. It's really amazing. I didn't put much weight on a lot of those things for a long time in my life and in my career. But if you do this long enough, you really see how deep the political cultures are across countries, how long cross-cultural feuds can last. My wife's expression is, if you can't forget the past, you are condemned to repeat it. Not if you don't learn the past, because it's the past memories that keep recurring in such deep cultural ways that we don't get past crises of 600 years ago. And this is really part of our problem. And I had emotionally, I had a very nice feeling in this meeting of the Eastern Mediterranean a couple of days ago. You're from Turkey, I assume?
Yes, I am from Turkey.
Yeah.
And we have worked in the G20 process and Think 20 process in Argentina and Germany together.
Yeah, great. So, we were just in Istanbul a couple of days ago because I'm bringing my family every few months to Istanbul so that they can see how beautiful it is and see the culture. And by the way, Turkey's doing a fantastic job. Erdogan's really doing a fantastic job in trying to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war. And the reason that he's so good and the reason the Turkish diplomacy is so good is, of course, it's the experts of the Black Sea. Who else understands the Black Sea region so deeply but Turkey? I mean, without question. And I actually went to Ankara for a day to talk to the mediators a couple of weeks ago and discuss the war. And of course, it's culture, and Turkey has a phenomenal diplomatic capacity because it's about 500 years old. So there's a very deep tradition in it, and it's very wise. And if this war is going to be ended soon, Erdogan actually is going to deserve a lot of credit for ending it. And what I was saying is, actually, I don't know whether it's true, but I felt it was somewhat emotional and meaningful. We had all these leaders and they let me speak, which was very nice. And I said to them, Your Excellencies, this region stretching from Egypt to Iran is actually literally is not only a cradle of civilization, it is, as far as we know, the cradle of civilization, because the first cities, the first civilization is in the Fertile Crescent. It is exactly in this region. And culture, as far as we know, even more than China, it's about 2,000 years before Chinese civilization began in along the Yellow River and the Yangtze. And I said to them, you know, you've had 10,000 years of resiliency in this region and 10,000 years of fighting each other nonstop, because as long as there's history, there have been wars between groups in the region. And please look after this. All our cultural heritage is there. You have to look after it for the next 10,000 years. I had very wonderful response from a number of the leaders and from a couple ambassadors who said, you know, this is so moving and so important. And okay, whether it was or not, whether they meant it, they seemed to be paying a lot of attention. But I think there was a sense, I think there should be a lot of pride in what we're talking about, and cultural pride in protecting our cultures and our civilization and our heritage, actually. And when a region that you represent that is 10,000 years old is under unprecedented, literally unprecedented strain right now in our time, I think we can find a lot of the means to address it through that sense of cultural pride and identity. But it's funny for me, or not funny, it's sad for me. What do you think of when you think of Iraq? For me, I think of a broken country and you know, a war-torn country and so forth. But when we think of Iraq, we should think of Mesopotamia. We should think about the first cities in the world, this great cultural heritage. Same with Syria. And that's not how these countries are placed in the world and are revered in the world. We should revere Iraq as absolutely the center of so much of our culture. And how can we help you preserve this place that has been at the center of human civilization for 10,000 years, with some of the most important heritage sites and so forth? So the answer to my question is we need the cultural grounding for sure to respond properly to this. Of course, culture divides as well as unites, though. So it creates identities, and whoever drafted the Bible and the story of the Tower of Babel was onto the deepest insight imaginable, which is, if you want to get human beings not cooperating, have them speak a different language, because it's these linguistic boundaries that are absolutely our deepest divides and problems, and yet we share the same cultural region. Every culture is so deeply intermeshed with each other at this point. The only fight is it Turkish coffee or Greek coffee, depending on where you buy it. But it's the same coffee is the point. And so I think we really need to fashion that kind of deeper understanding, somehow forging out of these distinct cultures, which are all intertwined, in fact, in anything, a shared understanding. I've been reading a lot of philosophy in the last couple of years and thinking a lot. I'm Jewish, and if you look at Judaism, it's unbelievable about how much of Jewish thought came from Egyptian civilization, came from Persian civilization, came from Mesopotamian thought. These ideas didn't just appear, despite the nice legend, they did not appear with Moses taking down the words on Mount Sinai. They appeared out of a cultural cauldron that is the entire region that we're talking about. And it was 2,000 or 3,000 years of incredible intermeshed cultures. And so you find in the book of Proverbs, you know, proverbs that are exactly the same as Egyptian wisdom tradition 1,000 years earlier. And, you know, it's not an accident. This is exactly incorporated into the Psalms or into the Proverbs and so forth. And so much of Persian thought shows up in post-exilic Second Temple period Judaism. I'm just mentioning it as an example. This is the wonderful joining of all these cultures in, and of course, all we have spent the rest of the time is pointing out the differences rather than the similarities and the shared heritage. But we need to point out the shared heritage, and we need to point out the shared dependency, and we need to point out the fact that, okay, we fought for 10,000 years, we've learned something, now let's be peaceful for the next 1,000 years and get on with the climate agenda. And I think this can make a difference. And I just read a very nice paper by Japanese scholars looking at an experimental public goods game with Chinese, Japanese, and Korean players. And he surveyed the attitudes of the other countries first by the participants, and then looked at propensities to cooperate in this public goods game. And of course, the attitudes towards the other countries meant was a huge factor in willingness to cooperate to solve the game in a cooperative mode. And yet, if you're an outsider looking at the three countries, again, being a little bit simplistic, but not entirely simplistic, you see an ancient Confucian culture in all three countries that shares so many important fundamental cultural traits. And yet the last 100 years has been very bitter and making it very hard to cooperate among the three countries. So that's all a long-winded way to say we need a cultural imagination to make this work. It's not just hard geopolitics, or it's not just hard cooperative game theory, let me put it that way, because that depends on trust, that depends on a common sense of shared understanding, that depends on finding a base in which we have a shared identity, not a distinct identity. Because the more we're drawing the distinctions, the more we're in a competitive, distrustful environment, and the less we're able to solve the cooperative challenges that we face. So anyway, that's what makes me optimistic. Fundamentally, we really are one family. I believe it, and I think it's true genetically. I think it's true historically, and I think it's true practically. And I think that that's the basis to say we're going to figure this out, and we will figure it out if we don't make some terrible, disastrous accident of war. If we avoid wars, if we avoid the escalation to disastrous wars, even though we'll be late, we're going to figure this out. That's my deep belief.
Thank you so much. You said a couple of things which really, not only beside my academic point of view, because, you know, I was born in Turkey, grown up in Germany, living in Germany, married to a German-Russian wife, so we're speaking 3 languages, and it's somehow really, and I feel the same. I feel that all those challenges right now we face, we must fix through a common culture, economic culture, education culture, and religious or worldly culture. Thank you so much.
And by the way, thank you for that. And the more we unpack and understand the roots of these conflicts. This is a little bit different from what I was saying. My wife says as a joke, but if we can unpack the sources of these conflicts, like I'm trying to do every day with the Ukraine war, which did not spring out of nothing, and it didn't spring out of Putin's madness. It sprang out of geopolitics and U.S. Russian politics and many other things. The more we can objectively understand these things and appreciate both sides of a debate, then we also, I think, are able to cross the distrust barrier. And this is really important. And it's not easy to do. And we're in a lot of virtue signaling right now that if you're not completely anti-Putin, then you're, reckless. And people called, a friend of mine told me I was despicable, or not a friend, somebody I know called me despicable and evil for calling for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine because I was siding with Putin and so forth. And I think that the issue is people don't really understand or don't want to understand two sides of a conflict. And the more you can understand both sides of a conflict, the more you could say, actually, there is a way to solve this thing. And that's why I think Turkey's diplomacy is so good, by the way, because they do really have a much clearer understanding about what this is about. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you for a chance to be together, and good discussion, great questions, and we'll stay in touch.